I mean, there's an example where Jenner literally did 1 week of research to come down to pretty much one sentence, but all the research was done in the area of biblical studies. And so there's a lot of that is also coming into it.
Well, maybe this is the one. Who authorized this? Maybe this is what we need.
Doug, okay. One more question, then we'll go to Joseph.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Dr. Feras, you mentioned about the example of Sakhar as being a very hot mountain that is found, which is a very interesting example for you to share in this context of your discussion about the elusivity of the Quran and the Tafsir and how it can be separated from each other. The reason I find that interesting is because on the one hand, we see historically that Sakhar is a physical mountain on the one hand, so this word is linked up with this mountain. On the other hand, the word is linked up with a place in hell, right? That linkage is what I'm very interested in kind of probing a little further in your inquiry, because I just recently, someone mailed me the first volume of a multi-volume Qur'anic Tafsir that's coming out called the Ascendant Qur'an. And this Qur'an seems to have a very activist bent in its interpretation, because you were talking about what would a modern Tafsir look like. And I have a deep respect for the project that Dr. DeCaig and others are doing, but it appears from the viewpoint of that interpretation, it's kind of looking back and then looking forward. Well, this one's more like, we've looked back enough. Let's look forward and let's put the Quran in its contemporary context.
This is the Ascendant.
The Ascendant Quran, right. Like what our current situation is. So just like you had that symbol of Sakhar being related to a physical mountain, connected on the one hand, and on the other hand, being connected to a mountain, to hellfire, excuse me. This author appears to be doing very similar, where he's taking concepts like Fir'aun and kind of linking it up, say, I don't know, I'm just going to make this up. With the World, right, with the World Bank, right, with the World Bank, or taking using ideas and concepts that are found in the Quran as parables or symbols to modern structures of our society. Again, doing that same extensional kind of element that you just mentioned with the term Sakhar. I wanted your comment on how would that be considered part of a modern tafsir, where it kind of separates itself from the Quranic text itself?
Well, it'd be interesting to read this Ascendant project. My example of Sakhar is really just to say this is one example of what historical, critical kind of, filling in the gaps would look like. We assume as much. I mean, how, the translation of all of the elements into the afterlife, the whole scheme of afterlife, for example, must take its cue from somewhere on this planet, right? I mean, so it's, in a sense, why are we surprised? But people are not. I mean, let's say medieval scholars have never been interested in that, as far as I can tell. It's only in the modern. It's a modern thing to be interested in that kind of work. It's a modern thing to think of, well, the Valley of Hinnom was a rubbish dump where they frequently burnt things, and so that became hell. And so this Valley of Sakhar was so hot, the Meccan tribes knew it, and so they would have understood the reference, وَمَا سَلَكَكُمْ فِي سَقَرَ, and then they would say, hey, why are you talking about Sakhar? This is, So it's a very obvious thing to do, but I'm not sure if it's the same as trying to find out. I mean, there are things beyond hope. I don't know whether we'd ever find out what Fir'aun al-Awtad means, right? But maybe something closer to home. But this is the point about the Corpus Qur'anicum. Again, I go back to it because it's just a convenient example. I mean, the Berlin project is trying to uncover this, Near Eastern context for the Quran. And I find it quite that fascinating, and that it can only be done in the modern. And actually, it should be a source of convergence. That finally, in the 21st century, both Muslims and non-believing scholars converge on what is actually quite an interesting reading of the Quran. That both, right? I mean, as a Muslim, I should be interested in Sakhar being a mountain, but so are the German scholars, right? This is a point in which the field of Tafsir actually has this, unique moment in time now that we converge. That these otherwise two quite different trajectories, one scholarly, well, I don't want to say that. I mean, a faithful one, a sort of approach to the Quran, and a purely historical, critical reading of the text might actually come together, or could come together, or should come together.
For different purposes, yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Hamza.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you also to George Mason and to the Verlag Center for having this conference, especially one that gives us an opportunity to talk some about the Qur'an project that we've already talked about. When one looks at the issue of the covenant in the Qur'an, it jumps out. It's really all over the place. When one looks at the Tafsir tradition, it is remarkable how often it comes up. You'll just have a mufassir say, and that is the ahd, or the mithaq, the covenant, and then go on. So you're just supposed to know what he's referring to. Now it's quite remarkable then that when we look at the fields of Christian studies, Judaic studies, Old Testament studies, and New Testament studies, we have this robust scholarship and debate on the meaning of covenant in their respective scriptures and traditions. There are dozens of monographs and hundreds of articles regarding the covenant. And each school even has a theory of covenantal pluralism, which has led to a lot of debate. Yet to date, there's really very little examination of the covenant in the Qur'an or in Islam. And a Muslim or Qur'anic covenant theology has not been articulated in the modern era. Nor is there really substantial engagement on the part of Muslims with the developments in covenant theology among Jews and Christians, whereas there was substantial engagement between Jews and Christians regarding covenant theology. Now, given the extensive treatment of the covenant in the Qur'an, where words pertaining to the covenant occur well over 100 times, it's not only surprising, to my mind, it's actually shocking. It would be an understatement to say that the understanding of the covenant between God and human beings is one of the many important Quranic concepts that remain severely understudied. To date, there are really only a few brief articles on the covenant in Islamic studies, and if any of the other scholars here know of others, I'd like to know of them. One is Louis Massignon's article, written in 1963. Another is one by Richard Gramlich, written in 1983. And then you also have a passage of about 20 pages in Gerhard Bovering's The Mystical Vision of Existence in Classical Islam. All of these are at least 20 years old, and none of them are in the field of Quranic studies. They're really all in the field of Sufi studies. In the field of Quranic studies, the covenant has been mentioned briefly by Arthur Jeffrey in The Qur'an as Scripture, written in 1950, and in John Wansborough's much debated Quranic studies. While both Jeffrey and Wansborough make interesting observations, neither provides any in-depth analysis. One can find brief mentions of the covenant in other studies of the Qur'an, but I have yet to find any comprehensive examination of it. Perhaps this is because, as Andrew Rippin argues, the various aspects, quote, do not form into one cohesive picture of a treaty covenant, end quote. Though that is not how most classical commentators, from At-Tabari in the 3rd Islamic century to Allama Tabatabai in the 14th Islamic century, have seen it. Now, given the lack of scholarship on this topic, we cannot even say whether or not this lacuna arises from the fact that the concept of the covenant is not as central to Islamic theology and self-understanding as it is to Judaism and Christianity, or that it is not as cohesive. As we will see in this presentation, the covenant is quite prevalent in the Qur'an itself, and according to many exegetes, it is central to the Quranic conception of humanity and of religious history. Now, given the amount of ground that remains uncovered, in this presentation I can only scratch the surface. I'll first examine the technical terms pertaining to the covenant and the relevant semantic fields,
Then I will highlight some of the predominant trends in the Quranic account of the covenant and the exegetical treatment of it, which often come in relation to verses where there actually is no mention of the technical terms for covenant. Now, the Quranic account of the covenant inevitably leads to biblical comparisons, but I'll keep these to a minimum. And then I will conclude with some observations regarding the implications of the Quranic understanding of the covenant. Now, two Arabic terms are central to the Quranic concept of covenant. The first is ahd, and the second is mithaq. And there are several secondary terms, such as isr, burden, amana, trust, and wa'd, promise. Several other verses in which none of these terms occur are also taken as references to the covenant. This is most notable in verse 7:172, which I will discuss extensively in this presentation. As Gerhard Bovering notes, 7:172 anchors the Muslim understanding of the covenant. Discussions of the covenant can also be found in the exegetical treatment of Quranic terms such as Hablullah, the rope of God, and al-urwat al-wuthqa, the most unfailing or the firmest handhold, among others. Furthermore, as Wansborough observes, other essentially neutral terms may in Quranic usage be lent divine sanction by occurring in context with ahd and its derivatives. Given this broad range, a full examination of such terms is beyond what I can do. I'll just focus on the terms and then the key verses in the Qur'an, those being 7:172 and 30:30. Now, the term ahd appears 29 times in the Qur'an, while its verbal form occurs 9 times. Ahd is rendered by various translators as covenant, pledge, pact, promise, among others. The term mithaq occurs 25 times, and it is rendered by various translators as compact, covenant, and plighted word. I don't know what that means, but that's one way that Yusuf Ali renders it. And these are just a few examples. Now, as Wansborough observes, ahd and mithaq are used interchangeably in the Quranic text. And like the Old Testament term barit, both can designate a covenantal or contractual relationship between human beings, as in several Quranic verses, or between God and human beings, as in the verses that I will examine today. In addition, ahd and mithaq are often treated as synonyms in the commentary tradition. I think that distinctions can be made, but in this presentation, I'm going to just use covenant to translate both. Now, ahd comes from the verb ahida, which is most commonly joined to the preposition illa, meaning, and when it's joined to the term illa, it means to enjoin or charge. As in 3660, Alam ahad ilaykum ya bani Adam alla ta'budu shaytan. Did I not enjoin upon you, or make a covenant with you, O children of Adam, that you not worship Satan? Also, verse 2:125, وَعَهِدْنَا إِلَّا إِبْرَاهِيمَ وَإِسْمَاعِيلَ أَنْ طَاهِرَ بَيْتِي. And I enjoined upon, or I made a covenant with, Abraham and Ishmael to purify my house. When used without the preposition illa, ahida can mean to fulfill, as in the phrase ahida ahdahu. He fulfilled his pact or his covenant. Thus, ahd in and of itself implies a reciprocal agreement and obligation, but when used with the preposition illa, indicates a unilateral, shall we say, agreement, in quotes, that has been enjoined by one party upon the other. Now, the term mithaq derives from the verb wathaqa, meaning to enter into an agreement or a contract. While Wansborough states that the most common Quranic usage of mithaq in the phrase akhadha mithaq, meaning he took a covenant, invariably expresses unilateral imposition, the classical texts do not agree with this interpretation. The term mithaq itself implies reciprocity between two parties, And while it usually occurs by itself in the phrase, أَخَذْنَا مِيثَاقٍ, we took a covenant, it also occurs in the phrase, أَخَذْنَا مِنْهُمْ مِيثَاقٍ, we took a covenant from them, which implies, and this I think is fundamentally important for understanding covenant in the Quran, it implies that human beings actually have something to give of free will in their relationship with God. In one commentary upon the use of the term أَخَذْنَا مِنْهُمْ, Allama Tabatabai, the great 20th century Shi'i scholar, notes that it implies both something taken, a ma'khudh, and something from which it is taken, a ma'khudh minhu, and cites examples such as taking knowledge from a scholar. In this sense, the Quranic use of the phrase أَخَذْنَا مِنْهُمْ مِيثَاقٍ, we took a covenant from them, can actually be taken to imply a manner in which God honors and elevates the human being, a theme which can be found in many other verses. Most notably, 1770, we have indeed honored the children of Adam. As many of the classical commentators have observed, such honoring is particularly evident in the phrase, who shall lend to God a goodly loan, which occurs twice and in other derivatives 4 other times. For it implies that although God is the creator, the Lord, and master of all, God nonetheless allows human beings to freely give back to God that which is God's. By extension, it could be taken to indicate that God allows human beings to participate in the covenant of their own free will. God thus gives human beings free disposition, tasrif, to maintain or to break the covenant. Such covenantal reciprocity is most evident in the famous verse in Surah Al-Baqarah, fulfill my covenant, and I shall fulfill your covenant. Having examined some aspects of the two terms that are central to the Quranic treatment of the covenant, let us now move to the central verses, after outlining a few aspects of the biblical treatment first. Now, as many scholars have noted, the main transition from the Old Testament understanding of the covenant to the New Testament understanding of the covenant is that in the Old Testament, the covenant is primarily for the Israelites alone, whereas the New Testament understanding is that the covenant has become universal, available to Jew and Gentile alike. While the book of Genesis does speak of a universal covenant with all of creation that is made after the flood, and that this has given rise to the concept of the Noahide covenant as well, this is not commonly understood to be the same covenant that is then made with Abraham and continually renewed through other patriarchs and prophets. With the Qur'an, the covenant is also understood to be universal, applying to all human beings. But in addition, it is presented as being pre-temporal, established before the beginning of creation as we know it. Some passages in the Old and New Testaments can be taken as references to an everlasting covenant between God and man. For as Psalm 105 declares, God remembers his covenant forever. But such passages only speak of covenants made between God and man during the course of human history, such as that between God and Abraham in Genesis 17, and that made with Moses and the Israelites in Exodus 19, which are then held in perpetuity and renewed over and again, particularly in the books of the prophets, especially Jeremiah and Ezekiel. Now, in the Qur'an, however, the eternality of the covenant stems from its being made between God and all of humanity before the beginning of creation. This is alluded to in 7:172. And when thy Lord took the children of Adam from their loins, their progeny, and made them bear witness concerning themselves, am I not your Lord? They said, yea, surely we bear witness. This verse has become the locus classicus for the understanding of the covenant in Sunni and Shi'i Islam, as well as the Sufi tradition. There are important variations in how it is interpreted in each, but there is a shared interpretation that serves as the foundation for each school's more specific interpretation. So I'm going to focus upon this shared baseline tradition, drawing mostly upon Sunni commentaries, chiefly those of At-Tabari, al-Qurtubi, Ibn Kathir, and Ahmed ibn Ajiba. Now, I just have to note, all the scholars here know that Ahmed ibn Ajiba is more of a Sufi tafsir, but in what I'm focusing on here, I'm actually focusing on his tafsir, not his spiritual allusions, because I find that his tafsir is a fantastic summary, in a sense, of what you might call a Sunni position. Now, verse 7:172 is reminiscent of God's promise to the children of Israel at Mount Sinai and their response in Exodus 24:7. All that the Lord has said we will do and be obedient. It also bears similarity to reaffirmations found in later books, such as Isaiah 43:10, "You are my witness, says the Lord." But here the Qur'an refers to existence before human beings are brought into this world. And they're in the loins of Adam, when the spirits of human beings are said to have been assembled before God on a single plane, just as it is said that they will be assembled on a single plane at the end of time for the day of judgment. God's question to human beings, "Alastu bi rabbikum," am I not your Lord, is said to be a rhetorical question whereby God affirms his principial reality as the Lord of all humankind. And the human response is seen as the everlasting affirmation of this covenant to which human beings are forever beholden. In addition to this covenant, to which all human beings must bear witness, several commentators, Tabari, Qurtubi, Shawkani among them, interpret verse 33:7, and remember when we took from the prophets their covenant, which is also, shades which are also found in verse 381, as a reference to another covenant, a second covenant, made after the covenant with all humanity, a covenant that is particular to the prophets, that they worship God, call others to worship God, and affirm one another. The remainder of verse 7:172, continuing into verse 7:173, establishes that in making this pretemporal covenant, God will hold human beings accountable for it on the day of resurrection, such that none will be able to claim that he or she was not responsible for the covenant. To quote, "This was lest you should say on the day of resurrection, 'Truly we were oblivious to this,' or lest you should say, 'It is only that our fathers ascribed partners unto God aforetime, and we were their progeny after them. Wilt thou destroy us for that which liars have done?'" In other words, many human beings may claim that they are not responsible for maintaining the covenant because their ancestors did not follow it, and they could not observe that of which they were not informed. But in fact, all of humanity is held to be responsible because all of humanity bears the imprint of this pretemporal covenant within. In this vein, Ibn Kathir says of verse 7:172 and 73, and several hadith that he cites in elaboration upon it, quote, "These locutions indicate that he brought them into existence as witnesses to this, asserting it, the covenant, both in their natural state and in their words. The witnessing is sometimes in words such as, 'They said we bear witness against ourselves,' verse 6:130, and sometimes in their natural state, such as the saying of God, 'It is not for the idolaters to maintain the mosques of God, bearing witness of disbelief against themselves,' verse 9:17. That is, their natural state bears witness against themselves in this regard, even if they do not assert it in words." This issue of the natural state is fundamentally important here. To continue with Ibn Kathir, "And likewise the words of God in Surah 100, verse 7, 'And truly he, mankind, is a witness to that.'" Based upon the subtle and elaborate discussion of covenant and revelation history in these and other Quranic verses, many Quranic commentators speak of two covenants that pertain to all of humanity. One taken before human beings come into this world, and another taken while human beings are in this world. That taken before is referred to by some as the general covenant, al-ahd al-am, to which human nature itself bears witness, while that taken in this life is said to be a particular covenant, at-khas, which is manifest through adherence to one of God's revealed religions that God's prophets covenanted to deliver in the particular prophetic covenant to which 33:7 is believed to refer. Each religion thus reminds human beings of the first primordial pretemporal covenant. As Ahmad ibn Najiba writes in his commentary on 7:172, they said, "Yea, surely you are our Lord, we bear witness to that concerning," or it could also be translated, against ourselves. Because all spirit